in relation to ISO 31000, that's fairly well established, and it tends to take primacy over other practices globally, mainly because it's a recognised standards, and there are obviously insurance and other considerations linked to it. Beyond that, and particularly in the security sphere, there tends to be a range of documentation that guides the manner in which different practitioners undertake security risk. In Australia, for example, there's the Handbook 167, which hasn't been updated since 2006, is in the process of being updated, but still provides a fairly broad degree of advice. There's 200+ pages in the handbook itself. There are legislation and industry codes, and it's noteworthy that the UK, off the back of the Manchester Review and the report that came from that, is in the process of implementing new legislation to compel organisations to conduct terrorist risk assessments, particularly those with crowded places. And there's a range of reference texts throughout the industry as well, and of course, which includes, and I think, to be honest, this is probably the most useful. I'm a little bit biased in that respect, given Julian Talbot's involvement with SECTARA, but the Security Risk Management Body of Knowledge is an excellent read. It went through to 2nd edition. I believe there may have been a 3rd edition being considered, but the contemporary version of that at the moment sits on srmam.com, Security Risk Management Aid Memoir, Julian's website, where he elaborates on some of the contemporary takes on principles and practices within SRM. There's common ground amongst those global standards handbooks, generally speaking, at least philosophically, in terms of alignment with ISO 31000. Most, if not all, consider assets, in a security sense, consider assets, threats, controls, vulnerabilities, risks, and treatments as part of their methodological processes. That's from SRM and srmam.com. Julian Talbot's take on the landscape, if you like, for methodological application, indicating threats, vulnerability, criticality, so on and so forth. The US has some very good guidance as well, if you tend to favour the TVRA, or Threat Vulnerability Risk Assessment approach. This is the Australian Commonwealth Government's methodological diagram for security risk assessments management. Interesting to note, if that sort of thing appeals, that the government practices a vulnerability informs the analysis of control effectiveness approach. And my view of that is that's fine if you're conducting, say, an automated or a manual vulnerability scan of an IT network, for example, where certainly the results of that process is identification of weak controls. From perhaps a protective security perspective, where we tend to visualize or observe controls in practice and then identify vulnerability attributes, that may be a more appropriate diagram. But otherwise, the practices are fairly comparable, and it does highlight the similarities between cyber and protective security, and that's very handy in some senses, and I'll demonstrate why when I get into SECTARA. So the challenges, did I skip one? No. The challenges in that environment then, and anticipating flipping over to SECTARA very shortly, as you'll appreciate, is that a genuine all hazards approach is not necessarily broadly practiced in a purist sense. From a software perspective, enterprise and even not using Excel or other products, enterprise or generic methods don't necessarily mean an all hazards suitable solution. And what I mean by that is the specialist tools needed for, say, security, even workplace health and safety and environment and others, don't necessarily appear in that generic ISO 31000 style method, and it limits what we can do in that respect. So where software has been adopted by enterprises, it doesn't necessarily cater for all functions, as I'm sure you're all aware. In that context, convergence, and I mean convergence in the sense of cyber and physical security and other practice areas within security, but also more broadly as well in relation to workplace health and safety and enterprise and environment, etc., so on and so forth, even financial risk. And it's pleasing in the sense that there is an amendment to the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act in Australia being driven by government, where it's quite explicit that an all hazards approach must be adopted. So that should be compelling critical asset operators to start looking or broaden what they're doing currently if they're not already doing effectively that sort of approach. Other challenges, we all know that we start with a template at some point, and through iterations that evolves over time to something that we never intended it to be necessarily. And there's a few challenges in doing that. The practices and quality assurance rapidly falls out of alignment with the intended degree of quality in the original template. It impacts productivity through quality, the inability to conduct consistent quality assurance processes quickly, and also to define on and build on those better practices that should really, each assessment ideally would go back to the original template and build on that rather than build on iterations that have been copied. Methodological rigour is certainly a casualty of our trade in terms of the adherence to standards, level of detail. Some assessments aren't assessments at all. They're purely a very basic security ISO31000 risk register, not necessarily security aligned. So there's challenges in defending such an assessment should it come to, say, legal recourse, or even the ability to justify a business case. It's not really ideal for those applications. From a productivity perspective, Microsoft Word, for example, doesn't contain libraries. You spend probably 20% of your time formatting, which is a challenge as well, and there are other issues in that sense as well. And also those types of solutions, say Word, don't necessarily offer. Excel does, but not to the degree that you necessarily want. Visual analytics that really communicate and get the point across. So in this particular bubble chart, there's a risk strategy. The strategies being accept, avoid, transfer, reduce, and you can see that the results are pinned in terms of the severity of the risk and what the strategy that's been selected on the chart itself. Now, I just flagged this is not in SECTARA yet, but it is mocked up for that purpose, so it will be shortly. And in terms of the use of any online system that sits outside the perimeter of an enterprise or an organisation, more broadly, security should absolutely be a key determinant in whether or not to use it in the first place, and if so, what to be wary of. That's a fairly, I may have overcooked it with that diagram, but if you're for argument's sake, a Gmail user, that could possibly represent the amount of third-party products that are used to integrate with Gmail or Google platform more broadly. And what that, as the cyber practitioners on this call will attest to, what that creates is a series of vulnerabilities and weaknesses in terms of assuring the security of data that you enter into any given system and how that data is treated. I have identified numerous occasions misleading statements on websites about being GDPR, Privacy Act compliant, encryption methods and practices, and so on and so forth. And where those statements are genuinely true, they're quite often true for only a portion of the solution that is actually being offered. So from a security perspective, that's a real consideration. And then thirdly in that list is the security provider security, service provider security. So that really relates to where a consultant or a service provider outside an organisation might be engaged to conduct a security risk assessment, for example, and in those cases, they'd be using their own resources, and rarely is an assurance process conducted over the security of those resources, and therefore security risk assessments can end up in the ether, shared between cohorts, but worst case compromised by somebody who's looking for your information. So not being able to exit here. I'll jump straight into it. So SECTARA, by way of a quick demonstration, and I don't want to dwell on this too much. I'd much prefer to whip through it fairly quickly and then take questions more on method rather than the product itself. It is a product demonstration, but I'm just going to do it in not too deep a degree, the familiarisation orientation sort of tour, and then we can perhaps go back to it if anybody's particularly interested. So logging in, you won't see a logo on the home page. That's because we allow a labelling of the product to facilitate the consultant's use case. When you first log into the product, you'll see a quasi dashboard at the top of the screen. These 4 boxes represent essentially the areas of critical mass or centres of gravity within the product. So users complete assessments. Assessments are saved or assigned to either business units or organisations if they're enterprise, because assessments cannot be orphaned. Left-hand side of screen, navigation menu, right side, user menu. I'm the account administrator, so I can change the plan. I can see my account details and change things for the account as well, and so on and so forth. You'll notice a reference to MFA. The platform's equipped with multi-factor authentication in the form of Google Authenticator. So if you download an app to your phone, scan the QR code when you first log in. Thereafter, you'll just be required to enter 6-digit code on top of your login credentials, should you choose to activate it. So the reason you come into SECTARA is obviously to create an assessment or to manage an assessment, or indeed to conduct activities that are related to assessments. So if you're in a high tempo environment, you wish to create an assessment, you can do so really quickly. And this goes to the productivity comment that I made earlier on. It's as quick as create assessment, select the organisation that it belongs to. For argument's sake, 1, 2, 3, security risk assessment, click save, and I can access it immediately. And that's truly how fast it is to create an assessment. What this message is showing you is that in order to get people started quickly, the criteria that's used in the assessment process is drawn from the account's default criteria. I mentioned before that the general consensus is around the inclusion of assets, threats, risk controls or risk control effectiveness, and risk assessment. Vulnerability sits within this domain and also in the first stage as well. So that implies that criteria must be made available to assess those items. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Within the criteria library is where the default criteria sits. For each of those, there's 3 options for the threat criteria, from a 3x3 through to a 5x5. All of those are account-wide and they can't be deleted. The reason being is that you don't create new criteria in the system, you repurpose existing sets. So for argument's sake, if I was to go into asset criticality criteria, I'd simply adjust that as I need it and then save it as I require. Going back to assessments, I'll pick on a favourite here. So here's one that's been completed previously. It's a critical infrastructure asset, in this case a dam. The first stage is around scope, context and criteria, and that, as I'm sure most, if not all, are aware, is the updated terminology from the previous version of ISO31000, whereas before it was external, internal and risk context. These days, the contemporary take is scope, context and criteria, which I think makes a lot more sense in the previous version. In terms of how that's addressed within the first stage, stage 1 is essentially the narrative of the assessment process. In order to edit, simply a matter of clicking edit, and you'll see that if you're familiar with free text fields and designs, this is about as close as you can get to Microsoft Word that we could find on the market. So in order to minimise the inconvenience of using an online version versus a local version, you can see how that's laid out. The scope is documented under the same heading. Context, there are legislative implications around a dam, obviously, particularly in Australia from a critical infrastructure perspective, geographical factors, references to budget and resourcing, and then what you'd call a segue, I guess, into the second stage of the assessment process. And just to educate readers who may not be security practitioners about why assets are included, and to introduce them to the fact that that is the second stage. Same with threat summary. Ordinarily, the way we go about conducting threat assessments, it's certainly not the only way, but we would indicate the threat actors that we're focused on based on the scope of the assessment, and then provide a summary, a narrative-based summary under each of those headlines. And you can see that's been done in this case. Then the risk control and references to vulnerabilities is again similarly is meant to introduce the fourth stage in the assessment process. The way we manage vulnerabilities is from two perspectives as well. Obviously, controls themselves can be vulnerable. There are also non-control based vulnerability factors that could and should be considered in an assessment. Things such as attractiveness, value, for example. Take the Sydney Opera House for argument's sake. That's from a terrorist perspective that has proven to be highly attractive as a target, but it's not a control factor. So how do you risk manage that? Well, there may not be any way to manage the threat based on the attractiveness of the asset, given that that's its singular purpose other than providing performances. So where that can be done, it should be done. And criteria as well, and this is mostly a reference to where the criteria, narrative-based description of where the criteria was derived from. So I dwell on that because that is the bedrock of the entire assessment process. It's the one that is primarily text-based. There shouldn't be anything through the remainder of the assessment process that is a surprise, because it should be canvassed in this first stage. The second stage, as I mentioned, is the asset assessment. You can see here assets that are relevant to a dam, employee, SCADA system, so on and so forth. And it's simply a matter of adding a new asset using quick add, or you can add from library, again, the productivity component. So getting started on assessment is very fast. Documenting the first stage is what it is. It takes time to document text, as it does in any assessment. But from this point forward, when you start accessing the libraries, it's a very fast process then to, for argument's sake, select from a long list of assets that are relevant to this assessment, and simply going in and identifying which categories they belong to for reporting purposes, and then setting a criticality rating based on the criticality that was set for the assessment. And I'll show that now. So you just saw the asset criticality assessment criteria. That is selected from a list which comes from the library. By default, it's applied. The default set of criteria is applied to the assessment for each stage, and it looks like that. You can adjust it within the assessment, and when you do, you can save it to the assessment, and that doesn't affect the library version. That's purely tailored then to this particular assessment. If you like what you've done in terms of changes, you can save it as a new template, and it will be saved to the library under a different name. It doesn't overwrite the original set. The threat criteria is based on an assessment of threat by intent and capability, and wherever you can see the three dots means you can, the appropriate administrator can adjust those values in the library or in this part of the assessment. We also introduced what we refer to as a threat tolerance, and I'll come back to that when we get to the threat assessment in a moment. Risk control effectiveness criteria is fairly straightforward. Ratings for moderate, adequate, inadequate in terms of how we rate controls. And then ultimately the risk assessment criteria is where you document your consequence, likelihood criteria, define your tolerance, and indeed the ratings and colours for the cells that will appear in the risk matrix. So when you get to the risk matrix, it's simply a matter of selecting which rating, and then that will be updated effectively to that colour. So having identified having documented the context in particular in the first stage, and obviously the scope, defined the assets, we're then starting to, what we're doing is building a story as we go through, and we're building on the formwork, which is the first stage. If you like, we're building the walls. Now we're inserting the windows and building part of the roof. And the reason I make an analogy is that we're building logic as we go through this entire process. So it's a highly defensible methodological process that you're demonstrating, particularly when providing a debrief or exporting the assessment and providing it. And as a consequence, there's genuine rigour to the process that you may not necessarily find in other processes, and which is difficult to replicate in Word documents, which is comparatively freestyle, if you like. From a dam perspective, and based on the scope of the assessment, in this assessment, cyber criminals, foreign intelligence service and terrorists have been identified. I'll focus on the cybercrime threat actor, cyber criminal. The threat act that's been identified is hacking. You can see there's a one-to-many relationship between actors and acts. Clearly, multiple acts can be perpetrated by individual actors. In this case, hacking is the act based on the assets that we've already created in the previous stage of the assessment. I didn't rate those, which is why you don't see ratings, but for the ones that are rated, that aren't already graded because they've already been added above, then you can very quickly select those items and add them to the assessment. And that's that building process that I referred to. It's then a matter of assessing that particular threat act by intent and capability. And in this case, we've identified it as hacking. Clearly, there are multiple threat actors in that space, and capability is fairly advanced. So it's been labelled an extreme threat. It's then a matter of identifying, documenting which controls currently serve to protect assets from those threats. And in this case, we've adopted the Australian government's approach in the Protective Security Policy Framework based on security governance, information, personnel and physical security, and the individual controls that currently exist in this organisation. It's not a PSPF list of the 16 policies. It's a list of what controls are currently established. And then documenting commentary on those individual controls in terms of how effective they are, where the vulnerabilities lie, and as a consequence, what the effectiveness rating is overall. And we've said, for argument's sake, for security governance policies, the organisation's developed a range of policies, but they're out of date and they require review to ensure currency. They're also not integrated, therefore it's been marked inadequate. And you would do that, so on and so forth, as an exhaustive a list as you're willing or need to document based on the scope of the assessment. You can see here our cyber or information security controls are pretty good across the board. So again, we're building the story as we go through the process, and it all comes together in the final stage, the risk assessment itself. You can see for purposes of methodological rigour, it prevents the ability to reverse engineer at this late stage based on personal preference or predetermined outcomes. That threats and primary assets in particular are hard-coded into the risk register. If you wish to, if you change that here, it would throw out the logic and you'd create a disconnect through this entire process. So it's very important that they are hard-coded and they can't be changed in this process. If you did want to change the results of the assessment process, it's a matter of going back and justifying that through the earlier stages, and particularly the threat assessment, in terms of arriving at an alternate outcome here based on the scope of the assessment, if you like. But ideally, it would be a fairly comprehensive list. So cyber criminals, hacking, extreme threat, they were the assets that are at risk, and it informs the process of documenting the risk description. And so the threat was hacking. The risk we're particularly concerned about here is that a cyber criminal uses social engineering, so there's a social engineering component to it, to solicit an attack through compromising a network and the sensitive information that is contained on it. The controls that are relevant to that particular risk have been documented here. They come directly from our controls assessment stage that populates that list, and you can see that they're coloured as well, and I'll describe why and why that's important in the risk register in a moment. It's then a matter of assessing the current risk as opposed to inherent. Based on a review of our consequence and likelihood, we've determined that it's a likely risk, or it's likely to occur, and it's going to cause a major consequence if it does, based on our consequence criteria. Just referencing back to our risk tolerance is medium, therefore a high current risk is an intolerable level of risk to the organisation. It requires to be mitigated to reduce it down in the residual assessment process. So therefore treatments are required. And this is where the colouring in the risk control and the current controls comes in handy. It's at the very minimum, the controls that are not green, for argument's sake, that's not precluding a focus on the green ones, but at a very minimum, in relation to this one, induction training and security culture, there should be some recommendations around this, and there are in relation to KPIs for performance reviews, CEO involvement and sponsorship, and information security component to online induction training. And beyond that as well, if there are, and the reason I mentioned current controls, if there are controls that don't yet exist, then they too should obviously be subject to recommendation. Now, I appreciate I'm saying nothing new in this process. It's really the value of SECTARA is how all of this is put together in a very logical manner, and in a manner that that provides and assures that methodological rigour. Excuse me. Having allocated or recommended treatments, it's then a matter of assessing residual risk. You can see it's dropped to within tolerances, and therefore that risk process is essentially complete, precluding, should you wish to fill out the risk owner details, and also identify the treatment effects and the risk types as well. There can be multiple risk types and indeed treatment effects. And once you've done that across the row, that's essentially the completion of that risk for the moment. You can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 risks in the risk register. But if we go back to the threat assessment, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 threat acts in that. And this is where the threat tolerance comes into relevance. In short, each threat act will, in the normal course of conducting an assessment with default settings, cause a risk to be created in the risk register, unless the threat tolerance has been set to a high level. So the threat tolerance in this assessment was set to medium, which essentially means that only those threat acts rated at medium and above will cause a risk to be created. And what that allows you to do is to truly take a more comprehensive approach to the threat assessment, but discriminate out the ones that aren't particularly threatening, if you like, for want of a better word, in terms of the acts that they may commit, and focus purely on those ones that are of higher threat in the risk register. Should at a future time rather, in this case, vehicle ramming become more serious in the sense of it being intent or capability increasing, and for argument's sake, it now becomes a higher risk, you'll see that in the risk register, and that's part of the monitoring and review process, but in the risk register, that will cause a new risk to be created and compel the assessor or the security risk manager to go back and now address that particular risk as well. And that's purely based on the threat tolerance setting. Once all risks have been completed, that's the assessment completed. And it's a very handy 5-stage process to debrief stakeholders in as well. It takes that black box phenomena away from explaining how security risk is done, and it is a fairly inarguable process as well. Really the only thing that could be critiqued is the perspective on the ratings, but assuming they're justified as they're populated, then that shouldn't be a problem either. From that, if I jump into the analytics component, you can see that there's at the moment some native charts. These are about to be improved, as I mentioned earlier on. You can see on a heat map the risks in terms of their movement. The yellow line in this case represents the tolerance rating. You can see that all risks are passed or around on that tolerance rating, meaning they're tolerable after treated. I'll just zoom out a little bit because I'm losing part of my screen. The threat table as well, your attention would be drawn to in a debrief extreme or the higher end ratings, in this case extreme, and you can see that there's from a cybercrime perspective, there's a hacking, that's the one we were looking at. From a foreign intelligence services perspective, there's espionage and also coercion, so on and so forth. Same with assets. Those that are most vital would be of most interest, at least initially. Systems, information and infrastructure are the parents. IT network, central functions, so on and so forth, and also controls as well. The controls that are the weakest in the context of this particular assessment include governance or security governance policies that we talked about, and over in physical security, perimeter security as well. If I go back to the assessment itself, you have the option to export the assessment and create a treatment plan. At the moment, if you export, well, in fact, in future as well, if you export the assessment, it'll push out a Microsoft Word document, and you can also create a treatment plan. At the moment, the treatment plans are Excel-based, and we're in the process of building the module that will allow the workflow, traffic light reports, and management of treatment plans within the platform itself as well. The exported assessment looks like this. Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of the banner at the top of the screen from Zoom, but I can't, so I'll keep on at it. The exported document looks like this. You can see there's some default content that comes with it. The logo that is different to the one that's in the account because the logo has been applied at the organisational level, and this particular organisation was the owner of Bundiwa Dam. By default, terms and definitions are populated. You can see the the name of the assessment gets pushed out, the date of the assessment, although that's from a couple of days ago, table of contents as well, and then scope context criteria. So the content in this section all the way to the end, which I'll scroll to, comes directly from that first stage of the assessment process. You can see the image where that was, the threat summary, so on and so forth, right through to the criteria sections. Around about 7 pages of text that was in that first stage. Asset criticality assessment is at Annex A, threat assessment Annex B, controls assessment at Annex C, and then Annex D contains the security risk register. And fairly neatly presented, I have to say. The assessment methodology, a reference to the standards that were that underpin SECTARA, and the criteria that was applied to the assessment appears at the final annexure. So a fairly neat exported template, relatively speaking. The treatment plan at the moment looks like this. You recall there were 5 risks, one-to-many relationship with the recommended treatments. For argument's sake, risk number 3, 3 treatments, and you can see there's some conditional formatting in terms of project managing the implementation of those. Some more too as well that don't, columns that don't fit on my screen. You can see the risk owner details populated automatically. What we've done also is allowed users to view, that's by viewing treatment plan by risks. You can also view it by treatment, because sometimes the same treatment is allocated to multiple risks, and in that basis, or in that scenario, that this particular worksheet would be more useful looking at it from a treatment perspective. So the first treatment applies to, is related to risks 1 and 2, and those are the treatments, those are the threat actors, and those are the risk descriptions or the risks. And then it allows you to document nuances based on, for the design of the treatment, based on the risks that it's treating as well. And again, there's more across the page as well. More broadly, each section of the system has a contextual video. So we're in assessments now, so it'll show me the 7 videos relating to creating through to exporting assessments. If I was in a different part of the system, I'd have the other videos as well. The library at the moment, the assessment library contains all of the details that were contained in fields on screen or available through libraries. And what the system allows you to do also is, you'll see here that information security control group is assigned to all organisations, and the inference there is that you can assign control groups to specific organisations where you want to restrict access to individual organisations for any given reason. It's particularly useful for the consultancy use case, but from a corporate perspective as well, if you have different distributed dispersed business units where you only want to display what's relevant to them, and that follows through other areas as well. Criteria is the same. In terms of users in the system, there are 5 user types. I'm the account administrator for this particular account. Organisation administrators, business unit administrators, and as you'd expect, there are decreasing levels of visibility and functionality based on the hierarchy. There's assessors. If you create an assessor and assign them to an assessment in the system, they only see that assessment. They don't see anything else, obviously. They can only populate the assessment. They can't change the criteria that was assigned to it. They don't see the export button, so they can't export the assessment from the system. It is a really good method to address that issue around service providers conducting assessments for an organisation. If you're using SECTARA, you just create them as an assessor. They do it in your system. They can't export it from the system. And as implied, viewers can view any assigned assessment, but they can't change anything, obviously. There's a knowledge base as well, which will talk you through the scope, context, criteria, and every other aspect of the system. The scope, context, criteria content comes directly from ISO 31000, so it talks through, for argument's sake, it'll talk through scope, context, and criteria, and the types of headings that you should consider under each of those areas. So if I click on scope to get started, there's a link in each assessment. By default, the text will link you to this page, and it suggests that you consider these particular headings here by way of a fulsome assessment aligned to ISO 31000. And that's really it in the system. There's some links down the bottom to our or a link to our support ticketing system as well. Beyond multi-factor authentication settings that I mentioned, which can be activated organisation by organisation, and also the logo being changed on the home page as well. So jumping back into the back end of the presentation, I won't talk through those. I just have not all of them anyway. In terms of security of the platform, multi-factor authentication, we've been IRAP assessed by our head of cybersecurity, David Begg, as being compliant. So it adds a significant degree of security assurance over, say, for argument's sake, ISO 27001. And only 2 people have access to the back end of the platform. That's myself and David Begg, both of whom have Australian government security clearances at fairly high levels, so you can at least have an assurance that we don't have criminal backgrounds, if nothing else. Data residency is at the moment here in Sydney. We are in the pipeline. We have a task to enable region by region preferences for that. So for argument's sake, if you're a UK-based subscriber to the system, when you're setting up your account, you have the ability to you will have the ability to set where your data is saved. And there's monthly, annual subscriptions to the platform as well. Sample of current users on the platform. Excuse me, and our roadmap. So I mentioned before the considerations around convergence, and I mentioned particularly workplace health and safety, but also enterprise and other functions. And we have, I'll show a screenshot of it in a moment, but what we're in the process of doing is catering for not just security threat assessments, but workplace health and safety, enterprise and other functional assessments. And the strength that we have in doing so is that we're coming from a specialist area, i.e. security, and I hesitate to use the term dumbing it down, but we're minimising or reaching into an area, say enterprise risk, which generally subscribes to the ISO 31000 style approach, and it becomes easier for us to do it or to cater for those users rather than stepping back the other way from an enterprise approach and trying to facilitate security practitioners. Document libraries in progress at the moment. That's not far off being completed, to be able to add documents to each line item in each assessment and to the first stage as well. And there's a new module coming, maturity compliance assessment module, which the references for that has been the Australian Government's Information Security Manual, international standards in the cyber security space as well, but also in the protective security domain. And that's really a strength of the platform to date, in that it's struck a neat balance, I think, between cyber security practitioner needs and those in the protective security space. And there's some other references there. So by way of a screenshot to that, I'm not sure how well you can see that, but this is the updated version of the threat assessment. The label there that you may not be able to see is threat/hazard assessment. Within this threat hazard criteria section, there will be 2 sets of criteria, one for threat and one for hazards. Depending upon which value you pick, whether it's threat or hazard in this first row, that will display a different set of criteria at the end of the row. So in this case, it's a threat, documented terrorists. So there's an element of intent and capability because we've used that particular criteria. Whereas if we document a hazard, it's a straight table rating, which will be in a different format, but it will be available through there as well. And that's how we'll accommodate the broader application than just security. We're unifying the libraries as well, and there'll be new items as a consequence of the new module and other functionality that's coming. So there'll be some additional libraries added to the system. And the new module will look something. This is a library version of a control set, but the assessment itself will contain control sets. So it won't look too dissimilar to that in terms of the compliance maturity assessment module. And the document library, as I mentioned, will look something like that in terms of which files are in the library and how to upload files as well. And what you will be able to do is use the URL. So if you have, for argument's sake, SharePoint or Dropbox, you just provide a link to that, and assuming you're signed in, then you'll be able to link to images, for argument's sake, or other documents from those tenancies, whereas other users who access that particular assessment won't be able to open them. There are new charts coming as well. This is, I'll call it a native chart, but it's a chart that will be available within the system as part of the assessment process as standard, but we're also, as part of a new module, integrating Power BI, Microsoft's Power BI for very complex analytics, should those or should users wish to need to do complex examination of data in the system, and that'll be a subscribe type basis when it is implemented. Some other charts that are coming as well in terms of current versus residual risk. And that's really it. So I apologise for talking at a million miles an hour. I tend to. In terms of interest from here, if there is interest in the system, we offer a free plan. It is exactly that. It's completely free. There's no limitation on how long it lasts for. It's not a trial version. You get 2 assessments in the system. So if you're a low tempo, low volume user, or you're happy just to overwrite your previous assessments, feel free to use the system. We really are keen to get users just using the system, and the free plan itself won't change. Bo.
Awesome. That was amazing. I couldn't take enough notes. I think you've made that look too easy for everyone, and I'm sure everyone was overwhelmed by how quickly you went through that. We've got some really good questions. I might start with the first one. That example you used, the dam, that was just an example, not the real dam, I'm assuming. That was just a template. Yeah. One good question was for any of our members or anyone who may have issues with color blindness, is it possible to change the colors in the ratings?
100%. So, and you've got a palette to do that. So for argument's sake, if I click on edit item, you can see, like Microsoft Word, you can change it to whichever color you like. The criteria is completely customizable. The only thing that can't be changed is the header row. So the criticality rating and criteria, for argument's sake.
Yep. Another good question that we got here was,
sorry, the only other fixed element to the system is we use a 5x5 risk matrix at the moment. That may change in future if there's demand, but there hasn't been to date. So that's the only other constraint.
How many languages can this support? Does it support multi-language for multi-users in different countries?
Not yet. It's coming.
One of the questions I had was, what happens if the client has a specific matrix to use? Do you just edit this, or can you import it into the platform?
Yeah, look, what I'd recommend is, because, as I mentioned, because each new assessment is assigned the default criteria for the account by default, if you, and it's a fairly, relatively speaking, it's a fairly assured method of making sure that at least everybody is provided in the assessment when they created an assessment, let's say the enterprise criteria. Then all you need to do is go into, for argument's sake here, the risk criteria, and you can see I can edit the labels, I can edit the values. It's a matter of just adding your own criteria and then saving your enterprises or your consultancies or whatever the use case is, preferred version of the default criteria as the default. And then by default, each assessment will load that criteria in future. If you wish to use other criteria, save it as a new template, adjust that criteria, and then load it once you get into the assessment. That's the method.
Yeah, wow. Oh, I think you just made this process a lot easier. For the risk categories, is it possible to assign a single risk with more than one category? So, for example, for theft of data, it's an InfoSec risk, but it could also be reputational. Can it deal with that?
Let me just confirm that I heard the question. Sorry, my volume's a little bit low here.
Sorry.
I can't adjust it any higher, but in terms of risk type, yes. Sorry, the word category threw me because we talk about asset categories, but risk types, certainly from a, I can give it any number of labels, individual risks for reporting purposes.
Yeah, and you also showed this in the assessment bit at the end. the risk register, you had the threat with the multiple categories in it. Controls, I think, from here down there, number 3.
So
Yep. So the actor can have multiple acts, is what you said. I think.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's obviously, terrorist for argument's sake.
Yeah.
And the reason for that, I have seen methods where, terrorist is the threat. There's no distinction made between threat actor and threat act, and then a description is made of their ability to carry out IED or armed shooter attacks. And then an overall rating is provided for terrorists in the context of the assessment. And clearly that's, that there's room for improvement in that process, because it's not a given that any given terrorist would have the same level of intent or capability to conduct a particular threat act. They may not have resources to improvise explosive device material, whereas they may have access to a weapon. So that granularity is, well, the reason for doing it in here is to achieve that level of granularity in that context and individually rate threats at the threat act level, not the threat actor level.
Yep, perfect. Here's a multi-faceted question by James. Does it allow for a consistent approach to value assets?
To value assets? Yeah.
So can they have different contexts, finance or safety? Can threats affect likelihood and consequences or different risks differently?
Sorry, I'm just trying to digest that in the manner
yeah,
it was intended.
This is it's a really good question.
Sorry, can you just ask it again?
Yeah. Actually, James, are you on?
Is that James Jordan?
You can, you can.
Just ask it. Just ask it again. I may have misheard.
Yeah. So he's asked. It's a very multifaceted, which is it takes a second. Oh, you there, James?
Yeah, I am. You just had to unmute me. I'll try and explain. It was a little bit hard to write down. So, from the question is I'm trying to understand that with the can it allow for different contexts of asset valuing. So I've come across a number of times where, so obviously, we have things like bills, things like that. Is there a way of plugging in that you can set asset valuing in different criteria so that it affects, it has a logical effect on asset value? So for instance, I've come across a number of times where policies will have, you will look at an asset in terms of its value against organizational outcomes, in terms of its financial value, its operational value, its intellectual property value, so on and so on, a dozen things that will all come together as the asset value. So basically, so that you understand what the impact is, should it be disrupted, degraded, or made unavailable. And then you can also add into that the vulnerabilities, and this is where you and I come across a little bit different in definition of vulnerability, or how we view it. What makes that particular asset vulnerable? What is the fact that how if it's made disrupted, what sort of level of impact does it have? That sort of thing in terms of asset valuing.
Yeah, look, at the moment, and it's an acknowledged omission at the moment, in that we essentially haven't got to adding asset attributes, and then the complex relationships that they have. I guess million tasks on the roadmap type thing. But I am very conscious that we need to be able to provide that metadata and the complex calculations and influences that have, particularly for assets and controls, because I know in the cybersecurity space that is, there's a very strong focus on controls and obviously assets as well in terms of managing those. So at the moment, and the document upload process will do that in a handrolic sort of way, where you'll be able to document the nuances of assets, but that won't have an automatic calculative effect, if you like, on the rest of the process for the moment. But look, with your concurrence, it's an interesting point. I very much would like to hear your thoughts on exactly how that could work for us, and they will certainly be taken on board. So with your concurrence, I'll jump off after this call, and maybe tomorrow or the next day send you an email, and perhaps we could talk, James.
Yeah, that'd be great. I look forward to that.
Yeah, really would welcome, in fact, anyone's views on what they've seen and what they would desire in a product. It's sometimes hard to solicit. You don't want to annoy your subscribers too much by reaching out to them. We don't do things like surveys on their net promoter scores and that sort of thing, particularly often. So when we do receive feedback, we tend to pursue it fairly rigorously.
Thanks, James. Another good question is, what's the logical calculation used to reduce the risk? So how do you calculate the risk and the residual risk? How's that calculated?
Yeah, so it's, as you observed, it's a manual process. So it's a qualitative process. It's not a quantitative assessment system. At the moment, there is potential to provide, numerical ratings in here instead of qualitative ones, and get semi-quantitative. I don't see, without us making further changes to the system, which we're not ready for yet, then it won't become quantitative. So it's purely qualitative in terms of referencing, for argument's sake, the impact of that particular risk on information. In this case, I think we said it was a major degree of consequence because compromise of information sensitive to the organisation, to the organisation's interests versus ongoing impact. So there's value in making sure the criteria is well defined as well, and then identifying an assessed likelihood rating as well. And we ended up with a likely and a major impact. Consequently, we have a high risk, and that tends to be how qualitative risk is assessed, obviously.
Yep, thank you. Another good question was, can a control set be imported into the software?
It will be once the compliance and maturity assessment module, and in fact it will allow gap analysis as well. But yeah, look, we appreciate that cybersecurity practitioners, for argument's sake, those using the information security manual, there could be hundreds upon hundreds of controls that need to be uploaded. So yes, you will be able to. At the moment, no. The library is fairly thin to start with, deliberately so. Less is more to get people started, but for the moment, it's manual.
Yep. There's a long one here. Let me just quickly. Okay, so value chain impact. The value chain is a different layer to the physical value, and this relates to materiality. And then there's another follow-on. Sorry, this is a three-part question. Maybe we might get John Serrano, if then you could open him up if you're happy to ask that question again, because this is there's a question here that goes through about 3 different sort of back and forths, and I think this might be a good one to pick up. John, do you want to run us through that question?
Yeah, so hi, thanks for allowing me to talk. One of the things that I come across on client sites, specifically the banking industry, is the value chain. The value chain has as James was discussing, there's the value that the process or asset provides to the organization, which is separate to its physical value. Sometimes you can actually have something that is of low physical value, but actually generates a lot of, say, income for the organization. Is it possible to have a relationship between a value chain, I guess, and the threat assessment? And I think that's pretty much what James was aiming at, because if you go into the banking systems or the banks, quite often all of their products are structured along the lines of value chain. How much value does an asset, being anything from a process to a physical widget, produce for the organization? And so the higher levels of protection are actually applied to the higher value items in a value chain. It could be IP theft of valuable IP that relates to algorithms that they use in calculation. It could be, and like the physical value of that is nothing, but the IP value is high. If that was played with by a hacker, you'd be in a lot of trouble. But could you put a price against it if you're trying to make a case to say, I believe that more policy, process, procedure and security needs to be applied to this part of the value chain, because that part of the value chain might make the organisation $1 million a week, but we all just look at it as a process step and a little bit of code and not much more. But if we put a value on it, say it produces $52 million a year, $1 million a week, you know, we're now talking about $52 million a year protected by single factor authentication, not multi-factor authentication. And we're also talking about the fact that, you know, this thing doesn't get backed up in the same way as other systems, whatever else. So you can actually separate the fact that you're backing something up on a tape or a disk to disk, whatever, versus the value of the process or algorithm, if you sort of know what I mean. Am I making sense, or am I just talking?
Yeah, look, I think I do. I think there's a two-speed valuation, if you like, or a two-factor evaluation to individual assets. One is its real value in dollar terms. The other is the value in the context of the organisation. So there's nothing stopping you from picking one or either, picking either of those for the purposes of the assessment. If you're doing a value chain assessment, if that's the flavour, then these descriptors could reflect relative scales based on the context of the organisation. If you're doing, or you could conceivably, I don't see how both of those could go together, given the variations in the value of individual assets. But if that's the question, can it be applied to the value chain approach? Look, certainly I don't see any difference in doing that, as long as, you know, you derive sensible descriptors. They could be dollar values for argument's sake. There's nothing stopping you from adding additional rows into that table as well. You know, any of these tables, any of the flat tables can have additional rows inserted, and you can have whatever scale you like throughout. As I said, I mean, you could take a semi-quantitative approach before by even giving these, you know.
Okay, so you could potentially blend quantitative and qualitative, but you wouldn't get an aggregated quantitative value. You'd still probably have to do some manual maths on that.
It's plausible that we will be able to do that with Power BI, if that's a particular report that's needed in that sense. Within the assessment itself, not at the moment. But again, look, if you don't mind, I'll follow up after this presentation process with you and tease that out a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd like that. And look, you know, the Power BI answer is probably, you know, the current answer that would be satisfactory.
Okay.
Thanks.
I think that's all the big ones, unless anyone wants to type in another question. I've got a couple of my own here. You said that you're currently hosted in AWS Sydney.
Yes.
So besides for the two system owner administrators, who else could get access to that data, or is it secure?
No, it's completely secure. The production environment is a separate instance to staging, only so it's completely different database, different server set, and the only people that have access to it are David Begg and myself. David's our head of cybersecurity. He's got a security clearance and does quite a bit of IRAP work as an IRAP consultant as well. So there's certainly no offshore access, and indeed that's extended to, there's no other access outside of us too. And I have to say that's an assurance that is rare in platforms like this. It's one that people don't like to provide because they like to retain the flexibility of bringing someone in, but it's one we put in place by design because we knew who our target demographic was from a subscriber perspective.
Yep. I might take one from Shane. It's very generous that you've offered the free offering. How many people, how many users, concurrent subscribers, or how many people are using the system at the moment?
We have 401 as of today, subscribers, active subscribers on the platform. There's around about 1,200 all up. I have to say, some of those may have been put off by the frequency with which we were doing or releasing service announcements for updates to the system. But at a point about 4 or 5 months ago, for current users, if there's any on the call, we found a method to do 90% of our updates in real time without interrupting, without putting up maintenance pages. So I suspect that of that 1,000+ users, many of which are inactive, except the 400 that are active, that may have been a cause of that. We've also had a lot of people through the COVID period looking to do risk assessments as well. Look, we did run a campaign around that, so people jump on and jump off. But 400 active subscribers at the moment. Wow. And I have to say too that that's geographically and functionally spread. So it's a neat blend of cyber and protective security, consultants and corporates, and globally dispersed. We've had I can't say I can't give any reason for particular countries, obviously, but you know, there's a couple. Australia is clearly the highest level of subscribers that we have. A lot of interest from South Africa, Israel as well, a few throughout the eastern side of Europe. So there's no rhyme or reason, and quite a few corporates versus government employee type subscribers as well, which is one of the things driving us to allow address the data residency issue, so that people can have data stored in their own region.
Yep. 2 questions from what you've just said. If this is based on 31,000, but you said it's easily physical and virtual, or physical and cyber, can we change to 27,001 and bring in those ISO?
I'm sorry, just say that again.
So in the physical, ISO 31,000 is the risk for physical mostly, but the cyber looks at 27,001.
Yep.
We can change that in the software so that it picks up from that side.
Yeah. Look, the platform is the whole reason it's able to accommodate that element of convergence is it's application agnostic. So the 27,005 is the information security risk management standard, and in terms of the effect of that, if you like, a cyber application versus a protective one, really it comes down to it's really around the controls. So and that's just simply a matter of populating the library. Sorry, I'm not even in the library. Populating the controls library with you know, cyber controls versus the other ones. Although in the spirit of convergence, obviously there's crossover between physical and personnel and governance as well in this case.
Yep, nice. And then I'm assuming that once you go past the free, there's a subscription and you can do more than 2, and that all opens up. Yeah.
It's we've got standard plans at the moment. You sign up the website, you can go through. It'll take a payment online, and it's hands-free for us. And those particular plans are limited in terms of each tier that you go up has a certain allocation, and then our platinum plans tend to be a little bit more custom.
Yep. Okay. Well, that's good. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I think you've really simplified the process. Hopefully you'll get a lot of people reaching out. If anyone doesn't have access, grab the details now, or go onto the SECTARA website and you'll be able to get all that information. I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. It was a really wonderful session. For those, there's a few messages in there. For those that didn't quite make it at the start, this session will be recorded and posted on the ACT Chapter's YouTube page by the end of the week, so you should be able to see that on Monday. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much, Konrad, for sharing that with us. I think that was really excellent.
My pleasure, Bo.
And have a good night and keep COVID safe, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to ASIS, ACT again.
Oh, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
guys.
Conrad.